So unsurprisingly, the research strongly reinforced that organisational leadership is integral to inclusive volunteering. Often, the most inclusive organisations have a champion who is particularly committed to inclusive volunteering who drives positive change. Hence the significance of this breakfast of leaders, which leads us to our next session, which is on leadership. I'd like to introduce Jeff Sharp, board member of Volunteering Victoria, to the stage to facilitate this panel. Jeff has been a member of the Volunteering Victoria board since 2018 and is going to lead our panel called Courage, Commitment and Collaboration, which will delve into more of the specific initiatives that leaders can do within their organisations. Please welcome Jeff.
Good morning. Well, we'd like to get straight into it, so I'd like to actually welcome up the panel members, if I might, and I'll use this as a way to introduce them as they come. First of all, we have Anthony Aitken, President of Volunteering Geelong, Councillor for the City of Greater Geelong. We have Melissa Hale, Coordinator, Disability Advocacy Resource Unit. We have Jake Lewis from the Project Governments Group of the Victoria Alive Project. And Leah Von Poppel, the CEO of Women with Disabilities Victoria. Please would you welcome them as they come up onto the stage and acknowledge them this morning. As our panel are coming up, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, elders past and present, and any elders who may be present from any other tribal lands or regions. I'm also struck this morning, as we have some off-land interpreters here. I recently did a function with an elder of the Wathaurong people around where I live in Ballarat, and they were sharing with me that it was the custom in this area when you went on to another tribe's lands that you did not speak the language of that tribe until you were invited to, nor did you speak your own language on their lands. You spoke in sign language until you were actually invited to speak. So you were invited to speak either in their language, if you knew it, or your own language. And I thought that that was quite remarkable, given for tens of thousands of years that has been occurring on this land. And more modern Australia, in the sense of the last 100 years, we're a bit behind the 8 ball. We need to catch up on that. Lovely to have you. This is meant to be an interactive panel session. We've got some questions. We will, if we have time, open it up to the floor for some questions. I've got some questions that I'm wanting to invite people to answer specifically. What I would like to do, though, is I'm going to ask the question. I'm going to invite the panel if they have a particular bent that you would like to answer it. I'm not going to invite you all to answer every question because we've only got half an hour to get through these questions, so we'll just see how you go. So if you can indicate to me how you would like to respond to that, that'd be fantastic. This is meant to be a very pragmatic session. We want to look at some practice and some things that you can take away with you. I will refer to it later, but please make sure you have a look in your pack. There's this flyer here. It's on your table, leading the way, making change in your organization for volunteers with a disability. And it includes your handy takeaway guide of 8 actions that you can put into place. And if you do it by lunchtime, then you get extra points, okay? So make sure you're actually, you take that away and have a look at it. I also encourage you to share those over social media if you're on social media. So welcome to our panel. Thank you for taking the time. There are 2 microphones there on the tables in front of you. If you can please make sure that you're sharing them, that would be fantastic. Here's the first question, and it's possibly the most challenging one. When I walked into the room, I saw some people that I knew. We were having a gas bag. 2 items into the conversation, what comes up? Funding, or rather, lack of it. Is there anyone in here that's overfunded? No, okay, didn't think so. The not-for-profit sector is full of people that are mission-driven, passionate, visionary people trying to do amazing things for their community. They are so short of resources. They're doing everything on the smell of an oily rag. Why should inclusive volunteering be a priority for them? Who would like to have a stab at that?
Does anyone want to kick things up?
You've got the microphone, Jake. I think you might
Okay.
be.
I just want to focus on the term limited resources and just sort of pick up on some of the things that Dylan was saying before around attitudes. People might think of access and inclusion as being something that's quite expensive and sort of, I guess, tricky to sort of engage in. But I think changing people's attitudes is probably one of the easiest and inexpensive ways to sort of get things happening and just kicking off the conversation.
Because it creates so many benefits for not-for-profit organisations. If you're a not-for-profit, you're probably already working with people with disabilities as your clients or as part of your target groups, and having them as volunteers is going to make the services that you provide feel safer to those people with disabilities. It also gives you access to an excellent new pool of potential workers in your organisation and a chance to see how you might creatively problem solve around hiring people with disabilities into your organisation if you're not already doing that and you're a little bit intimidated by it. And to go back to the funding question, I think this is a perennial problem for not-for-profits. I run one, I know this well. I think that one of the things that is really beneficial when you're thinking about any funding issue is thinking about 2 things. Firstly, that it opens up new pools of funding to you. So if you're looking at funding for disability-specific volunteers, for people with disabilities to be volunteers in your organisation, that's there are funding grants that are specifically designed for that. There are disability pools of funding, like Daniel was saying earlier, the information linkages and capacity building that you might be able to tap into. But funding is also something you can do creatively to solve broader problems in your community. We work with a neighbourhood house in a regional area in Victoria, and some of the women with disabilities who come into that program find that the biggest barrier for them is transport, because they have to come from 40 or 50 k's out of town. And so what the community house has realised is, okay, we need to find a way to get some accessible transport into our town, and they've been able to work with local health services and other interested stakeholders in the community to think about how to do that.
And that, in a simple sense, you actually will be able to use them as an asset, and that's actually why it should be a priority. I mean, Dylan's been a great role model this morning for people with disabilities to actually show, in fact, you can achieve more than what an able-bodied person can do. And I think that's what the volunteer sector has to actually understand as well too, is that people with disabilities are actually usually better volunteers than able people, and some of those reasons are because they're actually more committed, they're more punctual, they're more reliable, and they actually really do have an empathy with people that they're working with. That's actually why it should be a priority, that volunteers, they're actually the best people you can have, volunteers.
I've actually got a really good Cricket Victoria and Cricket Australia. And one of the things we found in terms of that value for money thing is because we run a deaf cricket team, and when we met with Cricket Victoria and Cricket Australia, who were quite corporate at the start, they started to see the joint value of investing into disability cricket. And once they started to understand how committed people with disability were to their deaf cricket club, blind cricket club, RD cricket club, because it was such a different community, a different lifeline for them, and it meant so much more than just a normal cricket club for them. It opened up new funding doors for them. It opened up, now Cricket Australia has a whole new disability cricket division, so it opens up more opportunities, more funding avenues. So it's not just about the cost, it's also about the opportunities it can bring to the organisation.
Seems to be this attitude, especially in the social services sector, I find, but it's present right throughout society, that says that people with the disability are the clients. So we don't look to them as co-workers, as volunteers, as people that participate in mission. They are people that we work, serve for. How do we shift that perception? How do we see them as the providers of the service? Any thoughts that you can bring to the room?
Of family violence services, became a volunteer for that very service, and managed to show their clients and their workers a different perspective on what it is like to be a person with disability experiencing family violence. So you're bringing, people with disability haven't led a privileged life like everybody else has. Their disability has meant that they've lived life with barriers. So what they're bringing into your organisation is that life where they're experiencing barriers because of their disability. So they're bringing a whole different perspective to your organisation that is really invaluable learning. So that is why they are valuable to the organisation, not just as a client, but as someone who can add so much more value.
Thank you. Anyone else like to add any thoughts?
I know they're cliches that people think, but if you actually sort of realise that that person actually is a volunteer and they've actually got some ability that can assist you, you shouldn't even be thinking about the disability they have. And it is important that we normalise people's disabilities in the community and volunteering, and actually recognise that everyone's got some capacity to be able to assist and participate and be involved in their community. And I think that is, for me personally, I think that's part of the problem. The first thing an able-bodied person does is they look at your disability first, and it would be really good if that was actually lowered on the scale for an all abilities person to actually say, how about you look at me as a person first? And once again, it's exactly what Dylan was saying. He loves his brother because his brother treated him like a brother, not as someone that was in a wheelchair. And and had all those great experiences from having the rivalry and the sibling relationship that he did have. And I think that's something that the volunteering sector has to understand is, lower what your first impression is about that particular person, and it's not their disability, it's actually their ability to participate.
I might actually pick up on that.
Thanks, Jake.
One of the messages from this project that really has resonated with me is thinking about the perception of the individual, and thinking about how, rather than thinking about how can we help this individual volunteer, it's how can this individual help us improve our organisation, and just shifting that perception. I think that's one of the big messages that really sort of struck a chord with me, and it's come out of this project.
Thanks.
valuing the expertise of people with disability are really strong. And I would say to all of you in the room today who are leaders within your organisations that that's a message you should be taking back and really promoting. It doesn't matter where you are in your journey in terms of setting up volunteering programs for people with disabilities or hiring people with disabilities into your organisation, whether you've got a disability action plan or you're just starting to think about all of this. It's really important, wherever you are along the way, to be asking yourselves as an organisation, how are we including people with disability in the design of this? How are we valuing their expertise? And what can we do to make sure that that's front and centre in the design and delivery of our volunteer programs?
Thank you. So I'd like to go on now and ask things that we often do in leadership is we look to examples of other leaders or other organizations. I always say the secret to my success was never actually having to have an original thought, just steal it from whoever you can, because there's always someone that's done it, gone there before. Go and learn from them, learn from their mistakes. When it comes to inclusivity in volunteering or inclusivity in organizations, is there anyone that springs to your mind that we should look to for lessons learned or models that we can copy, steal, rip off, all the good things that we do in the not-for-profit sector all the time? Any thoughts? Who should we be following in terms of
I think it was discussed before, ILC, Information Linkages and Capacity Building. There are a number of organisations that have undertaken disability capacity building projects, which is designed to build the capacity of the organisation to work with people with a disability. I think that's something that I would point to just initially.
anyone else want to?
Wow, Mark Vicker. Right, and we play in a normal mainstream competition, and at one point we needed some support, getting some training facilities and coaches and stuff like that. So we went to Cricket Victoria, who was quite corporate at the time, and just asked for some support and help and everything. And through developing relationships with them, we started to see, they started to learn that deaf cricket was more than just a cricket club. It was a lifeline for so many deaf people who were disconnected from their community, their families, and were using sort of like a cricket club as another family because the ease of communication and that. So they started to see cricket. They started to see cricket in a different lens. They started to see a different value to cricket. So they started to plan their strategy around developing cricket not just for deaf people but for blind people, for people with ID, and building it in their strategy so that now they have a National Disability Inclusion Championship. They have fully funded disability teams like an Australian Deaf Cricket team, an Australian ID team, an Australian Blind team that they send to international competitions. They have strategies to support people with disabilities to access Premier Cricket teams. They have goals to have people with disabilities to one day participate in mainstream Big Bash League teams. So through access to volunteers, they learn from, they work together with volunteers with disabilities to give people with disabilities, to help them shine and to give them the same opportunities as everybody else. So I think that is a good example of leading the way in changing their strategy to help people with disabilities shine.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anthony?
I just want to use an example able-bodied volunteer with a disabled volunteer, and essentially what the able volunteer is doing is assisting the person with a disability to participate in volunteering. So we're actually using some of the resources and assets that we have in the volunteer sector, which is we're all volunteers, and we're trying to match those together to try to put forward an opportunity for everybody to volunteering. And I actually think, I mean, still a very pilot-based project, but it is a great example of how we can actually try to normalise volunteering, and in fact try to address some of the funding concerns that we have. We're actually using our volunteers to assist in this process.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a specific question now, if I could. To Jake and Leah, based on your experience, when you live with a disability, there's many barriers to social participation, and our system is really good at dealing with one problem at a time, or one health challenge at a time, or you know, if you go into a hospital, they're really good at dealing with cancer, but not cancer and mental health. And you know, there's plenty of examples of that. But there's all sorts of other intersectionalities that occur as well, including aspects of identity such as gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, age, and socioeconomic status that can also affect. So there's, and it is a bit of a buzzword right now, intersectionality and that idea, but I was just really interested, how do you find that intersectionality impacts disability inclusion in volunteering? And have you got any examples from your experience of that?
I think that's a lot these days, and sometimes it can be a bit scary for people. Just as talking about a whole new area like disability inclusion in volunteering might feel a bit overwhelming and daunting, then drilling down into, okay, what do we do for particular cohorts of people with disability, like women, can feel really scary. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that that can be the case for people, and that's okay. I think for women with disabilities, often women, from a gendered lens, you have other issues going on in your life. Women are more likely to be taking on caring responsibilities, either for children or for their older parents or other relatives in their life. Women with disabilities are more likely to experience violence than men with disabilities or people without disabilities. So women with disabilities often come with two things. One, a lot of juggling, as women in general do, and two, possibly a more trauma-informed background. And so those are things that need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at volunteering opportunities. So if you have other flexibility in your system already that is designed for volunteers to be able to come and go a little bit more readily because they've got other commitments, that's brilliant, because that will suit women with disabilities. But you then might also need to think really carefully about, okay, so some of the opportunities we have might be working with people who come from really traumatised backgrounds themselves. What specifically might we need to ask women with disabilities about their needs before we start putting them into volunteer programs in that area? So I think the starting point is just two things. One, acknowledge if you feel a bit afraid about intersectionality, that's okay, and that you don't have to get it perfect straight away. But you do have to come with an open mind and curiosity, and that's the most important thing that you can have.
Yeah. Sort of maybe 12 months. It's only in the last sort of maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years that there's been a real push towards disability inclusion within the LGBTI community. I think, you know, the LGBTI community was built on volunteering. People weren't paid back in the day. It was something that kind of was built on volunteering and commitment to community and just love, I suppose. And there's a real need for people with a disability to be amongst their own in that sense. And I guess it's one of those diversities where it doesn't come from within the family, both LGBTI and disability. So you do really seek role models outside, externally, so there really is a need for connection to the community, and that can come through volunteering, and that's a really good way to get amongst it. Yeah.
Thank you. Given time, I'm going to take us straight to the end question now, if I might, which is, would you mind sharing with the audience today one thing that you'll take away from this morning, or one thing that you heard, or one new thing, or one thing you'd love to, just one thing that we should all walk away with? Who would like to go first? One thought.
I think it's really important to remember that you don't have to know everything about every disability to be inclusive, but it's important to know how to try to be inclusive. In your pack today, there is a guide called How to Be Disability Inclusive. And what it does is it teaches you how to step into the shoes of a person with a disability and imagine how it must feel to have that barrier in your life. And if that was the barrier you were facing every day, what things might you need to overcome that barrier? And feeling and thinking about those barriers will help you straight away feel that barrier and become more inclusive. So don't feel like you need to know everything about every disability to be inclusive. It is possible to learn how to try.
I just wish to say, don't be frightened about people with a disability. In terms of thinking that you have to do more work to enable them to be a volunteer. As we've already touched on, in fact, they're probably better volunteers. So the main message that I would like all of you to go away from today is that they're really just an untapped resource and asset, people with a disability. And if you actually recognise that as a sector and not think that it requires more funding, more intensive support and more resource allocation when you don't have that resource allocation, I really think you'll embrace the asset that's actually underutilised out there in the community, that people with disabilities really do want to participate and be volunteers. And the reality is most people, and statistically most people with disabilities don't work or have limited work, so in fact they've got more hours available to be volunteers.
Jake?
I think another message that came out of this project that sort of resonated with me was just the idea of and it's built into capacity building as well, which is what can we do with what we already have? It's not about spending millions of dollars on accessible ramps and things like that, but just having a frank conversation about where we are as an organisation or as a community, and sort of working with what is already in place to sort of make things more accessible and inclusive for people with a disability. So it could start today. Yeah.
Thank you. Leah?
My big takeaway from today is that besides being disabled, Dylan Alcott and I have something in common. We really don't look like it, but I realised when Dylan was speaking that he and I both know a young man called Luke. Luke is the young man who went to Dylan's Accessible Music Festival. But Luke is also someone I know from my previous job. He started with us as a volunteer, and he started out being really shy and really quiet, but it very quickly became apparent to me that Luke was a leader in his wheelchair sports team. He was a really reflective, open person, and he was in his mid-20s and he'd never had work. And so we snapped him up. We hired him into his first job, and I think that in 10 years' time, I will be dining out on his name. Because he's so fabulous at what he does. And sometimes bringing volunteers in gives you opportunities you didn't even know you wanted or needed to make your organisation richer. Bringing people with disabilities in can give you benefits that we can't even tell you about. Unintended consequences are beautiful things. Please be open to them.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the panel session. Please, would you put your hands together again for our panel for taking the time. Thank you for being so generous with your time and sharing with us this morning.